Hey everyone, I'm back. Next up is the Beyond Visual Line of Sight Future of Drone Software and Industry Standardization by James Howard, founder of CTO of Iris Automation. And we're going back to San Francisco, California to connect with him. But before I connect you, how are you all doing? Are you tired? I am a little bit tired. I've been awake since a couple of hours now. I don't even have a sense of time. What time is it? I still have some energy for a few more sessions. Don't forget to ask questions on chat, join us on Slack, follow us on social media. You also want to quickly remind you that there's an after party scheduled for tomorrow and that the link is only going out by Slack. So please join us. It's going to be fun. That's tomorrow at 3 p.m. Pacific. More details on Slack again. So let me connect you back to James in California. Give me one brief minute and he's all yours. James, can you do me a quick favor? Let's do a quick audio check.
Yep. Hello, test one, two, three.
Awesome. I think I can hear you well. If I just
Great.
get confirmation
Yes.
and give me 1 second. I think we're good to go. How's everyone doing? Yes, we're good to go. All right, guys, this is the PX4 Dev Summit live from Tijuana. And next up, James Howard from Iris Automation, speaking about the Beyond Visual Line of Sight future and standards adoption. It's up to you, James. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Roman. And hi, everybody. I hope you're having a good time at the summit, and thank you for joining my presentation. Today, I'll be going over Beyond Visual Line of Sight and how we can get there through standards adoption. A bit of background on myself as we begin. I am the co-founder and VP engineering at Iris Automation. My background is in mechatronics engineering, space systems, and unmanned aircraft systems. At Iris Automation, we develop the Cassia system, which is an onboard detect and avoid technology that leverages computer vision and artificial intelligence to enable autonomy and increase safety within the airspace. Today, I'll be going over Beyond Visual Line of Sight and how that is achieved practically at the moment, as well as a discussion of the future of Beyond Visual Line of Sight drone operation, an overview of the standards that are being developed and released for UAS that are related to that, and where I see the PX4 and open source communities can continue their leadership in that space. Hopefully the outcomes today are an introduction to what regulators are thinking of when assessing Beyond Visual Line of Sight operation. Hopefully I can also spark some ideas for you or give you insights into how to operate drones beyond line of sight, and really kick off a conversation and collaboration amongst the open source community in enabling people who use the technology, the open source technology, to fly beyond line of sight. So a background on BVLOS, it's really the dream that everybody has had for drones from the very beginning. Thinking of the Jetsons and flying cars and package delivery fully autonomously is really where I think a lot of the industry wants to get to. And BVLOS operations for drones is really the first step to full autonomy within airspace, within the airspace and just aviation as a whole. Beyond visual line of sight operation implies either no operator or a remote operator with very limited situational awareness about what is happening where the drone is flying, and that produces concerns from civil aviation authorities about airspace integration. Their job is to maintain and improve safety of the airspace, and so introduction of autonomous systems needs to be done in a careful manner so as not to impact that safety. As many of you are probably aware, BVLOS is fundamentally required for many different industries and applications, including search and rescue, scalable linear infrastructure inspection, package delivery, land and resource management, and urban air mobility, which is the fancy name for flying taxis. So to give you an idea of what the challenges are, well, the number one is safety, like I mentioned. And I wanted to share with you what this looks like from a practical perspective. So this is an image that was captured from a drone with our detect and avoid system on board. And you can see that we've made a detection of someone in the airspace around the drone and decided to take an avoidtive maneuver so as to keep that airspace user safe. And this is what it looks like zoomed in. What we came across was a paraglider. They're a very small aircraft. They entered the airspace completely unannounced. They have no radio, no ADS-B, no engine noise to cue a human operator, and they're flying at low altitude. And this is what governments and regulators are concerned about, is with the introduction of drones into the airspace, existing users like this could be severely impacted. And we want to prevent that from happening. So detect and avoid is one way there. And it's good to know that beyond visual line of sight is actually achievable. It's not completely walled off. We've seen in the United States an increase in approvals for 107.31 waivers, which is a waiver from the requirement for a visual observer, increasing over the recent years. And using the appropriate safety technology, BVLOS is achievable today. But as we'll talk about, the future will be a much smoother process through the adoption of standards. Currently, different countries have different processes, but the commonalities are operations within low to moderate risk airspace, using an onboard real-time detect and avoid system, and adopting a systems and operations approach to risk analysis, usually through the SORA process, the standardized operational risk assessment that was developed by JARIS. So the future of BVLOS is really to make this process a lot easier, make it a standardized process where standards for hardware, software systems, and procedures are adopted, and where the industry can move from permission to regulation. The difference in language there is that permissions are exceptions to an existing rule to allow you to do something outside of that rule, whereas a regulation would be a standardized rule set where if you meet the requirements of that regulation, you can operate without permission, just by default. And so the future of the industry is to move beyond visual line of sight to a standardized regulation where drones can freely operate within that regulation. And it's going to take a lot of industry cooperation to get there. Right now, many drones are built in a piecewise approach where many different components are sourced from many different vendors. And quite often the operator is the integrator. And there's a lot of overhead required under that paradigm for the integrator to do analysis and testing and verification to prove to the regulator that their system is safe for beyond visual line of sight operation. And so as standards are adopted and as systems are built, that becomes an easier process. So the future of beyond visual line of sight will require or include regulatory certification of complete drone systems, as well as subsystems to those drones. Ways that can be achieved are through the technical standards order process that exists today, as well as compliance and product testing for new standards that are being developed. And we'll talk about some of the ones coming out of ASTM in a moment, as well as type certification of unmanned aircraft systems, which is something that has really come about in the United States recently, and many companies are moving towards that. So at the end of the day, what it boils down to is that systems that meet standards receive a higher trust and face a simpler approval process from regulators around the world. And as we build more and more systems to standards, that trust builds and will set the future of where this industry goes. So the goal at the end of the day is a repeatable standards procedure to fly fully autonomous aircraft. A quick introduction to some of these standards. So who is defining them? Right now, at least in the United States, that is primarily ASTM and RTCA. Both organizations have had a history in the aviation industry for defining standards, and they have taken different approaches, where ASTM has focused primarily on small UAS and RTCA on larger UAS. And today we'll talk about ASTM. And just for background, in the United States and in many other countries around the world, a small UAS is one that is less than 55 pounds or 25 kilograms in mass. It's also worth noting some of the existing standards for aviation and avionics and where they fit in. So the common ones that are referenced are DO 178, 256, and 160. Currently, we're seeing that the need for those is really when people are on board the aircraft, and that they're not currently being applied to small UAS operating in low to moderate risk airspace, especially with the adoption of these newer standards that we'll talk about. And I guess lastly, how do we know what will be adopted and which standards matter? In our experience at Iris Automation, it comes from direct feedback from global regulators. We work with customers in the United States, Canada, across Europe, in South America, Australasia, and many other countries around the world. And we amalgamate a lot of feedback from these different regulators as they're assessing the programs that our customers are involved with. And that gives us insight into what's coming next. So looking at ASTM, we are expecting that the FAA is going to adopt in 2020 and 2021 two standards, both from ASTM. One is the UAS Software Dependability Standard, which covers a lot of software development procedures, test procedures, validation procedures, and a lot of organizational and process structures. The other is the Detect and Avoid Minimum Operating Performance Standard. And that's really what I'm going to focus on this talk, because it covers a lot more of the functionality of the drone and the safety and performance within the airspace. So a bit more technical as opposed to organizational. That standard covers the detect and avoid system, as well as its integration into the UAS system, which is the autopilot and the airframe and the performance of that aircraft. And it also covers the ground station integration, as well as human factors in remote operation using a detect and avoid system. So it's quite a holistic look at the full system beyond just the detect and avoid itself. It's how does that detect and avoid enable this drone to function autonomously and at the end of the day beyond visual line of sight. So it really touches PX4, Mavlink, and QGroundControl, as well as CASIA, our detect and avoid system, and how they work together. So who is impacted at the end of the day? It comes down to the DAA, detect and avoid system manufacturer. So Iris Automation is one of such manufacturers, as well as the manufacturer of the UAS, the integrator of the UAS, and the operator of the UAS. And really the reasons to adopt this standard and to think ahead of where the regulators are in their requirements today is that by having technology that is compliant to a standard, it's enabling for everyone within the industry. Standards provide a simpler path for a customer or for an operator to go from procurement to operating beyond visual line of sight. And that really helps the entire industry grow and build trust between what we're developing today and the regulators who are approving its operation within airspace of their countries. So PX4 and open source can really lead in this regard. PX4, as well as other open source softwares, are already global leaders within the UAS market. And so we're already in a great position here where that leadership can be maintained into the future. I think that, as I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, that the different working groups and communities that are contributing to these pieces of software and to this technology need to begin starting or having conversations that include standards within those conversations. That it's more than the functionality of the software that needs to be assessed, but also how that software affects the end user and their application. And open source, to me, is really all about change and collaboration, and continuing that collaboration and continuing to work together collectively is going to be what's needed to make this shift towards standardization happen. So I'd like to see the community leverage the existing collaborative approach in the adoption of new standards. So drone code is a really good facilitator of that, especially between industry and open source. And the forums, of course, GitHub, Slack, the other different channels that open source has, or this community of open source contributors has, to continue that discussion and continue collaborating with one another and with industry who are implementing these pieces of software and technology into the airspace and working with the regulators directly. And like I mentioned, taking a systems level approach. So one example that I'll go into a minute is that a change to the ground control station could actually affect the compliance to a complete system, because these regulators around the world are taking a systems level approach to risk analysis. So they're not just looking at the autopilot or just looking at the drone airframe itself, but how that entire system works within their airspace. So looking at the ASTM detect and avoid minimum operating performance standards specifically, there are a few gaps within the QGroundControl, PX4, and MAVLink that we have identified. And those are the requirement for continuous alerting for detected failures to the remote operator. So a temporary alert or a pop-up is not adequate to meet the requirements of the standard. It needs to persist until that failure is rectified. Additionally, adoption of Advisory Circular 25.1322-1, which is a bit of a mouthful, but in the United States anyway, it defines colors and terminology that should be used for alerts to a human operator of an aircraft. And currently, the alerts in QGroundControl are a single color, always look the same. There are specific requirements in the United States for human factors interaction between avionics systems and the operator. Lastly, for QGroundControl, the standard specifies that there must be visual awareness of any suppressed functions that could impact safety. So one of those is the auditory alerts that can be generated from alerts that come into the ground station, that text-to-speech engine. In PX4, the requirement for payloads such as detect and avoid systems to be able to talk directly to the ground control station via the command and control link is a requirement. And this is something that I think is functional in some cases, but not necessarily all. And then lastly, the standard defines geospatial alerts where the remote operator can essentially be shown where a potential collision might happen, as well as when that might happen, showing it on the map, showing it with velocity vectors of the intruders. Certain requirements like that are set out. That being said, the software has already been designed extremely well. QGroundControl and PX4 follow great design standards, and there are many parts of the requirement that are already met by the systems today. So having alerts that are visual to the operator is required, something that pops up that shows the operator, hey, this thing is happening, as well as the requirement for active dismissal of those alerts, so that they won't just go away after 5 seconds and the operator is left wondering, what just happened? I missed that. The requirement to click the X button and actively dismiss that alert is already implemented. And then lastly, the text-to-speech engine already being implemented is another requirement as well. That's covered through the standard as well as the advisory circular for being able to notify an operator. Maybe they're not looking at the map at the time, maybe they're referencing their operating procedures manual, and they need that auditory input. And then in PX4 Autopilot, we see that the peripheral device heartbeat monitoring as well as fail-safe action already being implemented as a key part of that standard, where the aircraft itself is able to detect as well as react to potential failures of subsystems and safety systems that are required for that beyond visual line of sight operation. So the most important of those that is required from global regulators is the detect and avoid system. And then there are other systems as well, such as ADS-B or FLARM or UTM input that may be required under certain jurisdictions, and being able to detect failures of those subsystems is extremely important and already implemented within PX4. And then along with that, a generated alert to the ground control station about that failed peripheral. So we see that QGroundControl PX4 already has quite a few of the features that these standards are starting to talk about and will be required in the future, and some new features and adjustments to the way things are done as examples for what this specific standard is talking about. So in summary, beyond visual line of sight today is really a stepping stone to what it will be in the future, where we are operating in a world where permission is required to operate beyond visual line of sight. And the goal and the eventual outcome is to see repeatable standard regulation so that beyond visual line of sight can be conducted by default if you meet the requirements of that regulation, in the same way that a pilot is able to go and fly their plane whenever they please because they meet the requirements of the existing regulation. And that's where we want to see the drone industry getting with beyond visual line of sight. And the way to get there is through standards adoption and building trust with the regulating bodies. And PX4 and open source communities can continue leading as they already have to date. And really, I'm excited to move on from this presentation and hopefully continue a conversation with myself and Iris Automation and other companies with the open source community, and start building out the technology to meet the safety requirements and meet the input that the regulators are having and want to see from the community. So thank you very much for joining the talk. I hope this was a good overview of or a little introduction to regulation. I think there's a lot more to say, and I want to continue that conversation now and into the future.
James, can you hear me?
I can.
Thank you. This is Ramon from GroundCode. Thanks for that awesome presentation. Wow, what a way to end the day. You're right. The standards adoption is the key across the industry, and we're glad that you touched on this point because that's what GroundCode is trying to do. And we want to invite everyone that is listening right now. If you want to join us and start talking about regulation and standards, this is the perfect time to do it. There's momentum. We're here, we're waiting, and there's no better time to do it than now. Thank you, James. If you would do us a favor, can you join us briefly on Slack? There's a few questions that would be awesome if you can join us there for a short Q&A session. Fortunately, we're out of time on our live stream, but I really want to thank you and Iris Automation for all the effort that you did to be here today.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm glad to be able to contribute and share our knowledge. And I will definitely move over to Slack now to answer some of those questions.
Sounds good. Talk to you soon, James.
Thanks. Bye.